Number 1. Marie Noe. For decades, Marie Noe was viewed as one of Philadelphia's most tragic mothers. Between 1949 and 1968, she and her husband Arthur buried 8 of their 10 children. Each baby died before the age of 14 months, and each death was ruled either crib death or sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. The community grieved for her, the newspapers wrote sympathetic stories, and neighbors pitied her endless misfortune. But behind the curtains of her modest home was a horrifying truth. Marie Noe was no victim of fate. She was the cause. Marie grew up in Philadelphia, married young, and longed for the picture-perfect family life. But motherhood for her was marked by chaos, frustration, and an explosive temper. Medical records and later investigations revealed that she struggled emotionally, often describing her babies as burdens. Time after time, she buried infants, yet no one in authority questioned the pattern. Doctors accepted the diagnoses of SIDS. Priests comforted her at funerals. Even her surviving children grew up believing their siblings had died from mysterious illnesses. It wasn't until the late 1990s that suspicion finally caught up with her. Investigators re-examined the 8 deaths and noticed disturbing consistencies. Every child died under Marie's watch, usually while in her care alone. In 1998, police confronted her, and she confessed in chilling simplicity. She admitted to smothering at least 8 of her babies. Her motive: overwhelm, frustration, and a desire to quiet them. She claimed she never meant to hurt them, but her actions left an undeniable trail of tiny graves. The confession shocked the city. For nearly 50 years, she had hidden in plain sight, her crimes cloaked in sympathy. Prosecutors charged her with 8 counts of murder, though a plea deal eventually reduced the charges to manslaughter. In 1999, Marie pled guilty and received a sentence of 20 years probation, with the first 5 under house arrest, along with mandatory psychiatric treatment. For the public, the outcome was controversial. Some argued she should have spent the rest of her life in prison for ending the lives of 8 innocent children. Others saw her as a frail, elderly woman, already in her 70s, whose punishment was living with the truth of what she had done. Marie Noe's case remains one of the most disturbing examples of maternal infanticide in American history. It forced changes in how investigators view repeated infant deaths in one family, ensuring such tragedies are no longer so easily explained away. But for the 8 children whose lives ended in silence, justice felt incomplete. Marie lived quietly after her sentencing, largely out of the public eye, until her death in 2016. Her legacy is one of deception, misplaced sympathy, and the devastating consequences when suspicion comes too late. Number 2. Sarah Jane Whiteling. In the late 19th century, Philadelphia became the stage for a chilling story of greed, manipulation, and death. At its center was Sarah Jane Whiteling, a woman who looked like an ordinary housewife but harbored dark ambitions. Known today as one of Pennsylvania's earliest documented female killers, Whiteling's case shocked Victorian society and left an enduring scar on the history of women and crime. Sarah lived with her husband and 3 children in a modest Philadelphia home. Outwardly, their family life appeared normal, though financial troubles weighed heavily on them. To neighbors and acquaintances, Sarah came across as respectable, even pious. But behind her outward calm, she nurtured a deadly solution to her problems, one rooted in arsenic and insurance money. The deaths began in 1888. First, her husband Frank fell mysteriously ill. Within weeks, he was dead, his symptoms resembling poisoning. Soon after, Sarah's young daughter also became violently sick and passed away. Then, only months later, her son followed the same tragic path. Each death brought Sarah not just pity from her neighbors, but also payouts from life insurance policies she had carefully taken out beforehand. When authorities noticed the pattern, suspicion mounted. It was unusual, even in those times, for so many deaths to strike one family in such quick succession. An autopsy confirmed their fears. Traces of arsenic were found in the bodies. Sarah was arrested, and her chilling motives came to light. She had killed her husband and 2 of her children for money. The insurance payouts were modest by today's standards, a few $100s each. But in the 1880s, that sum represented a small fortune for someone like Sarah. During her trial, Sarah showed little remorse. She admitted she found her husband dull and not exciting, and claimed her children had been in the way. The press painted her as cold, calculating, and unfeminine, a woman who had betrayed the sacred trust of motherhood. The Victorian public was both horrified and fascinated, packing courtrooms to glimpse the family poisoner. In 1889, Sarah Jane Whiteling was convicted and sentenced to death. Her execution by hanging marked a grim milestone. She became the first woman to be executed in Philadelphia County. Contemporary newspapers sensationalized her final hours, noting how she prayed and sang hymns before walking calmly to the gallows. The case cemented her infamy. To many, Sarah represented the darkest betrayal imaginable, a mother destroying her family for personal gain. She was a stark reminder that beneath the polite veneer of Victorian womanhood, ambition and cruelty could lurk in deadly forms. Today, Whiteling's story is studied as part of Pennsylvania's criminal history, not just for its brutality, but for how it challenged cultural notions of femininity and morality. She was no grieving widow or victim of circumstance. She was a woman who weaponized trust, turning her family into victims and herself into one of the most feared figures of her time. Number 3. Hannah Mary Tabbs. Philadelphia in the late 1800s was a city of contrasts.
Younger man. But for me, I feel like this kind of story, ironically, is it's super important.
Booming with industry, yet haunted by crime and poverty. In 1887, the city was shaken by one of its grisliest cases, a story of jealousy, brutality, and betrayal. At the center of it all was Hannah Mary Tabbs, a black woman who used violence to get what she wanted, and whose crime became one of the most notorious of the era. Hannah Mary Tabbs was no stranger to the darker side of life. Born into slavery in Maryland, she moved north after emancipation and built a life for herself in Philadelphia. Known for her fiery temper and commanding presence, she was both feared and respected in her community. Those who crossed her often found themselves threatened or assaulted. But even her reputation could not prepare the city for what she would eventually do. In February of 1887, the mutilated remains of a young man named Wakefield Gaines were discovered in a pond near the city. His head and limbs had been cut from his body, and the discovery horrified the public. The case was immediately labeled one of the most grotesque murders Philadelphia had ever seen. Police scrambled to trace the body parts, and soon suspicion fell on Hannah. Hannah had been romantically involved with Wakefield, but was also married at the time. Their relationship had grown volatile, filled with jealousy and accusations of betrayal. Investigators learned that on the night of his death, Hannah and an accomplice, George Wilson, had lured Wakefield into a trap. What followed was brutal. Wakefield was beaten, strangled, and then dismembered in a shocking attempt to conceal the crime. During the investigation, Hannah showed little fear of authority. She was defiant under questioning, admitting her role in the killing, but shifting much of the blame onto Wilson. Newspapers seized on her boldness, portraying her as a tigress with a frightening capacity for violence. The sensational trial drew large crowds, as the idea of a woman, particularly a woman of color, at the center of such a gruesome crime was both scandalous and sensational to Victorian society. Ultimately, Hannah Mary Tabbs was convicted, but not of murder. Instead, she was sentenced to just 2 years in prison for being an accessory to the crime. Her accomplice, Wilson, was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. The relatively light punishment Hannah received outraged many and fueled public debate about race, gender, and justice in the post-Reconstruction era. Hannah's case stands out not only because of its brutality, but also because of how it exposed the biases of the time. Some believed her gender shielded her from the harshest punishment. Others argued that race and class played an equally complicated role in how justice was applied. Though her prison sentence was short, Hannah Mary Tabbs left behind one of the most infamous cases in Pennsylvania history. Her story is a chilling reminder of how passion, jealousy, and rage can explode into violence, and how the justice system of the past often reflected the prejudices of its time. Number 4. Ann Carson. Long before organized crime and modern-day scandals, Pennsylvania had its own brand of infamous women who blurred the lines between criminality and notoriety. Among them was Ann Carson, a woman whose life in the early 1800s became a blend of daring plots, personal tragedy, and repeated brushes with the law. Unlike many female criminals of her time, Ann reveled in the chaos, gaining the reputation of one of Pennsylvania's earliest celebrity criminals. Born Ann Baker in the late 18th century, she married a naval officer, Richard Carson, and lived what seemed to be a respectable life. But after her husband died, Ann's world unraveled. Left to raise children on her own, she found herself both financially unstable and socially restless. What followed was a series of increasingly reckless decisions that put her on a collision course with the law. Ann's first brush with notoriety came when she fell in with a circle of counterfeiters and forgers. She became romantically involved with Richard Smith, a notorious counterfeiter, and quickly immersed herself in his world. But it was her daring kidnapping plot that cemented her infamy in Pennsylvania history. In 1819, Ann Carson and her associates devised a plan to kidnap Pennsylvania Governor Simon Snyder's son-in-law in an attempt to force concessions from the state. The plot was audacious and reckless, and it failed spectacularly. Ann and Smith were arrested, tried, and convicted for their role in the conspiracy. Unlike many women of her time who sought mercy by playing into societal expectations of feminine frailty, Ann was unapologetic and defiant. She relished the attention and became something of a spectacle in the press. Her intelligence, wit, and shameless boldness earned her both scorn and admiration. Newspapers portrayed her as a dangerous woman who thrived in the underworld, but also as a tragic figure, undone by her passions and poor choices. After serving time, Ann's troubles didn't end. She was repeatedly implicated in counterfeiting schemes and theft. Prison time became a revolving door for her, and yet each release seemed to only add to her legend. Eventually, Ann Carson's luck ran out. She was imprisoned once more, her health deteriorating rapidly behind bars. She died in prison in 1824, at just 43 years old. Ann Carson's story is striking because it foreshadowed a kind of criminal celebrity culture that would later become more common in American history. She wasn't content to hide in the shadows. Instead, she embraced her infamy. Unlike many female criminals of her era, Ann didn't seek forgiveness. She sought attention, defiance, and a kind of power that came from shocking society's expectations of how a woman should behave. Today, she is remembered as one of Pennsylvania's earliest and most infamous female outlaws, a woman who lived and died by scandal. Ann Carson's life reminds us that even in the 19th century, crime and notoriety could go hand in hand, and that some figures embraced infamy as their legacy. Number 5. Heather Pressdee. In the world of healthcare, trust is everything.
Also breaking right now, a former nurse accused of playing a role in the deaths of more than a dozen nursing home patients pleads guilty.
Families place their loved ones in nursing facilities believing they will be safe, cared for, and protected in their final years. But in Pennsylvania, that trust was horrifically shattered by a nurse named Heather Pressdee, a woman whose duty to heal turned into a trail of suffering and death. Heather Pressdee's story begins like many others in nursing. She was trained as a registered nurse and held positions in various care facilities across Pennsylvania. To the outside world, she was another medical professional, someone tasked with one of society's most sacred roles, safeguarding the sick and elderly. But beneath the surface, there were troubling signs that her career was unraveling long before her crimes came to light. Co-workers described her as volatile, with a history of clashing with supervisors and patients' families. She frequently changed jobs, moving from one nursing home to another, leaving behind complaints and concerns that were often brushed aside. In hindsight, those red flags painted a chilling picture. But at the time, no one realized the scope of what she was capable of. In 2023, investigators revealed that Pressdee had been secretly administering lethal doses of insulin to vulnerable patients in her care. Some of her victims were elderly, others younger but disabled. They were people who depended on her not just for medical care, but for survival. Instead, they became targets. Prosecutors allege she killed at least 2 patients and attempted to kill over a dozen others, spanning multiple facilities. Her motive remains murky. Some speculate it was a twisted attempt at control, others believe it stemmed from resentment or a desire to play God with people's lives. What's clear is that she exploited her position in the most devastating way possible, Families who entrusted their loved ones to her care were blindsided by the revelation that the very person meant to protect them had instead been plotting their deaths. When Pressdee was finally arrested, the charges stunned the state. She was indicted on counts of homicide, attempted homicide, and neglect. The case sparked outrage not just for the loss of life, but for the failures and oversight that allowed her to continue working despite repeated red flags. In May 2023, Heather Pressdee pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Unlike many historical Pennsylvania cases where justice was delayed or denied, this time the system responded with finality. She will never walk free again. The Pressdee case highlights one of society's deepest fears, that the people we trust most can sometimes cause the greatest harm. It also exposed systemic cracks in the healthcare system, where staff complaints and warning signs were overlooked until it was far too late. For the families who lost loved ones, the pain is immeasurable. For Pennsylvania, the case of Heather Pressdee stands as one of the state's most chilling reminders of betrayal. Not by a stranger in the dark, but by a caregiver in the light of day. Number 6. Shannon Womack.
She was perpetrating not only a fraud, but not providing the care that was needed.
Not every crime in Pennsylvania's history of female offenders involves murder. Some are built on lies, deception, and the reckless pursuit of power. Shannon Womack's story is one of audacity, a woman who assumed false identities, infiltrated medical settings, and endangered lives by pretending to be someone she was not. Her case is a stark example of how fraud in the healthcare world can carry consequences just as devastating as violence. For years, Womack drifted through hospitals and medical facilities in Pennsylvania, presenting herself under various names as a licensed nurse. She wore the scrubs, spoke the language, and carried herself with the confidence of a trained professional. Patients and families believed she was the real thing, entrusting their care to a woman with no right to hold a stethoscope. What made her crimes particularly disturbing was the sheer brazenness of her deception. Nursing is a highly regulated profession, with strict licensing boards and credential checks. Yet Womack managed to slip through cracks in the system, working at multiple facilities where she had access to controlled medications, sensitive patient information, and vulnerable lives. Her schemes came to light when colleagues began questioning her knowledge gaps and inconsistencies in her paperwork. In one facility, she used an alias and even fabricated identification documents to secure employment. Investigators later discovered she had stolen prescription drugs, manipulated records, and placed patients at risk through her incompetence. When police finally moved in, they uncovered not just one false identity, but several. A tangled web of aliases designed to cover her tracks. Each name gave her a new opportunity, and with each job, the danger to patients grew. Her actions weren't just a matter of fraud, they were a betrayal of one of the most trusted professions in society. In 2023, Shannon Womack was formally charged with identity theft, drug diversion, forgery, and practicing medicine without a license. Prosecutors emphasized how her deception endangered lives, making her case one of the more unusual, but still deeply alarming crime stories in Pennsylvania. Unlike killers such as Heather Pressdee, Womack didn't take lives directly. But by posing as a nurse, she jeopardized the safety of countless patients who relied on her supposed expertise. Her arrest reignited calls for stricter hiring practices and oversight in Pennsylvania's healthcare facilities. How could someone repeatedly pose as a nurse without being stopped sooner? Why weren't her references and credentials more thoroughly checked? For the public, it was another reminder that, even in professions we view as sacred, cracks can be exploited by those determined to deceive. Today, Shannon Womack's story stands not as one of bloodshed, but of calculated fraud. Yet in the world of healthcare, where mistakes can be fatal, her crimes echo with equal gravity. Her case closes our Pennsylvania list with a sobering truth. Danger doesn't always wear the mask of violence. Sometimes it wears the uniform of trust, a nurse's scrubs worn by someone who was never a nurse at all. As we've seen, Pennsylvania's history of female criminals is a spectrum of extremes, from women who poisoned their own families, to con artists spinning webs of deception, to killers hiding behind trusted uniforms. Each of these cases reminds us that crime is not confined to a single type of person or a single motive. It can grow out of desperation, greed, trauma, or simply the audacity to test how far one can push the boundaries of trust. Marie Noe's story remains one of the most chilling, a woman whose role as a mother was twisted into something unthinkable. Sarah Jane Whiteling, in the 1800s, poisoned those closest to her, a reminder that even in earlier centuries, domestic spaces were not always safe. Hannah Mary Tabbs shocked the city of Philadelphia with her gruesome dismemberment crime, a crime so violent it earned headlines that still echo more than a century later. Then there were women like Ann Carson, whose notoriety was not born of bloodshed, but of schemes, plots, and a defiance of authority that left her infamous in the early 19th century. Fast forward to the modern era, and we find Heather Pressdee, a nurse who used her position to play God with the lives of her patients, injecting insulin not to heal, but to harm. And finally, Shannon Womack, who may not have murdered, but who shattered trust by impersonating the very profession people rely on in their most vulnerable moments. What unites these women is not just the crimes themselves, but the unsettling questions they leave behind. How could such acts have gone unnoticed until it was too late? What does it say about our systems, our families, our medical institutions, our courts, that these women found opportunities to commit their crimes? And perhaps most importantly, why are we still fascinated by them today? Pennsylvania's infamous female criminals remind us that evil does not always appear in the form we expect. Sometimes it wears the face of a mother, a caregiver, a lover, or even a healer. Behind each case lies a lesson in vigilance, accountability, and the thin line between trust and betrayal. And as you reflect on these stories, ask yourself, which one disturbed you the most, and why? Thanks for watching. If you got value, smash the like button, drop a comment, share with a friend, and hit subscribe. Don't forget the bell so you never miss a video. See you in the next one.